The Safer Ontario Act received royal assent last month, so it's now the law in this province. It's the first major update to the Police Services Act in more than a generation. Among other things, it reforms aspects of police oversight, a pressure point for many looking for change in how Ontario is policed. Does it do what's needed? And what should modern policing in this province look like? Let's ask. Peter Sloly, he's a partner, national security and justice leader at Deloitte, and a former deputy chief with the Toronto Police Service. Ian Scott, visiting professor at Western Law School and former director of Ontario's Special Investigations Unit, and Awkwasi Owusu-Bempah, assistant professor of sociology at UTM, that's the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and we are pleased to welcome three familiar faces to our program, back to our set here at TVO tonight. Let's just, Sheldon, shall we start with this graphic here, just to get us up to speed on some of the no pun intended, bullet points of the new Safer Ontario Act. Expanded powers to the SIU, that's the Special Investigations Unit, to investigate current and former officers. It enacts the Ontario Policing Discipline Tribunal, replacing the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. And it establishes the Ontario Policing Complaints Agency, replacing the Office of the Independent Police Review Director. So let's start to go through some of this. Ian Scott, to you first. How different are the oversight mechanisms in the Safer Ontario Act, this new act just passed, than in the previous version, the Police Services Act?
Well, there's really two aspects to oversight, one being the SIU right now, and the other being the Office of the Independent Police Review Director. In my view, the really big change is the OIPRD. And when we think of the difference, think of SIU being criminal investigations, and the other one being public complaints, which could lead to disciplinary consequences. And the SIU changes, in my view, are somewhat cosmetic. There's not radical changes in that area.
Is that okay? Did it need radical change?
No, I don't think it does.
Obviously you're the former head of it, so I'm interested in what you have to say about that.
Well, it doesn't need radical change. I mean, I would have done it slightly differently, and there were some changes that went at the very end that I think, unfortunately, take away some of the impact from the TELC recommendations. But overall, I mean, the focus of the SIU is quite clear. It does investigations which could lead to criminal consequences when the police are involved in death, serious injury, or allegations of sexual assault. And I think some of the changes that have come about in the new act are good. One being, they have increased this mandate marginally to include just discharge of firearms where there's no injury. And that will, I think that's a good thing in the sense that there won't be arguments with the police about when the SIU mandate should be invoked. There is much more emphasis on public relations in terms of making sure they're going to be reports in every single time the SIU mandate is invoked. That will mean that even in what, for want of a better expression, some of the more minor serious injury matters, there will be full reporting. When I was at the SIU between 2008 and 2013, I did try to change things so that there are going to be full media reports where there was death involved or where there was high-profile cases. But we just simply didn't have the mandate, or we didn't have neither the mandate nor the manpower, person power, to have full reports. Now with the new legislation, there is going to be public disclosure of full reports, and I think that will help in terms of accountability of the SIU.
Peter Sloly, how much transformation do you see in this new Safer Ontario Act?
Well, there's definitely some positive changes. Large T transformation, no. But I'm not sure that through legislation you accomplish large T transformation. That's more a factor of will and skill, of leadership from ministry right the way down into the guardroom of police services and in the back rooms of boards. But there has been an effort to bring to life a greater level of oversight, not just through the OIPRD and its rename or the SIU, but in terms of police services boards. The requirement with a lot more sticks than carrots for boards to take training, to publish diversity strategies for their own governance, and to select and performance manage chiefs of police, as well as to participate in coordinated community safety and well-being plans. The Act requires the police, in concert with the municipality or the region, to develop these community well-being plans, state outcomes, and form true partnerships, not in the way that we've talked about in the past, but you actually have to form advisory partnerships and develop plans that are going to be implemented together. Again, will and skill, it could be something that could be done, with a nice bit of paper, or it could be something where health care professionals, educators, local, regional and municipal leaders, and police leaders of the day actually get together and talk about systemic issues like racism, unemployment, true social justice issues that underpin crime and can be the solution to raising the level of quality of life and reducing crime. That's bringing a much more focused approach to community policing. Execution, of course, is going to be what determines whether or not it is even small t transformation.
Sure. Awkwasi, I'm not saying this is happening here, but it has been done in politics in the past, that if you get a lot of public complaints about a particular agency, you change the name of it, but you don't necessarily change the mandate of it very much, and you think you've solved the problem. Do you think that's what's going on here?
Well, I think in respect to what is currently known as the OIPRD, we see a name change there, and this could be what you're referring to. I think one of the key changes that we're seeing there, though, is the fact that the new agency will now manage complaints internally rather than oftentimes fielding complaints and then sending those back to the police agencies in question.
And what do we think of that?
Well, I think that's a fantastic move. Again, as Peter said, we need to see how this rolls out. But I think one of the complaints, so if we think about the circumstances of people complaining to the police, if you're wronged by a police officer or a police service, the last thing you want to do is go knock on their door and have them deal with the complaint itself, as used to be the case. So the OIPRD came around, and this was a conduit through which complaints could be managed. But I think there was some trouble with, and certainly the perception of a bit of a weakness in the fact that many complaints were going back to those police agencies themselves. And the fact that there will now be a body to actually deal with those complaints itself is a positive move forward.
Here's how the Attorney General of Ontario describes what he's all about here, as quoted in the Globe and Mail last month. This bill is very much about strengthening the trust and respect between the police and the communities they serve. The legislation we have passed today really sets the framework for modern policing in the 21st century. Peter, can more accountability help struggling relationships between the police services and the communities that they work in?
As I said earlier on, I use the term carrots and sticks. Accountability comes with the stick end of it, but there's got to be carrots. You've got to incent individual officers and, more importantly, police services and their boards and their municipalities to consider what modern policing looks like in their area.
And how do you do that?
Accountability on its own is not going to accomplish it. So yes, there should be, the requirement to develop plans and put them out publicly so people can see what you say you're going to do, and then match to see whether or not the outcomes are there. Transparency in terms of processes. So not having police investigate police, but having that as part of a level of oversight. Those are elements of transparency that will incent as well as hold account. But you also have to come back to the other end. Create a framework around which a police officer or someone who's considering being a police officer says, that's the job I want to do. That's the type of service I want to be involved in. And there is enforcement in there, but there is community well-being. There is addressing underlying systemic issues. There is recognizing diversity and pluralism in our society. And that's as much a part of being a good police officer and providing good police services, effective, accountable police services, as is catching the bad guys and locking them up. I say that, though, catching the bad guys and locking them up is a critical part of policing, always will be. And we saw that in great detail in terms of the tragic incidents that took place here in the city of Toronto. So we can never lose sight of that unique and specific role of policing, but we can build out, through carrots and sticks, through accountability systems and transparency programs, a more complete way of policing in real coordination and cooperation with local communities.
We will come back to the events on Yonge Street of Monday afternoon a little bit later in our discussion here. Do you think, Ian, that this bill achieves the kind of modernization that the Attorney General of Ontario clearly does? Oh,
I think it's a big step forward. I think the biggest step is, frankly, not the area of the SIU. It really is in this area of public complaints. Up until the passing of this bill, and I might say, although it's received royal assent, it's not been proclaimed yet. And it's being proclaimed...
we should just explain that. The Lieutenant Governor gives royal assent.
Yes.
But then the government has to proclaim it, meaning here's the date upon which it actually goes into effect.
Exactly. And my understanding is they're going to kind of roll it out incrementally. The changes to the SIU are going to happen, barring changes as a result of the election, on June 28th of this year. And it's going to take about a 5-year roll-in, as I understand it, for this new police complaints agency to get fully funded and fully resourced. This is a big change. What is happening is, under the current system, as indicated beforehand, virtually all complaints, public complaints, went back to the affected police service and were investigated by their either internal affairs or professional standards department.
Which didn't meet the stink test for a lot of people.
Not only was the issue of the investigation, the prosecutor, if indeed there was going to get to that stage, and the hearing officer were picked by the chief of police. So in essence, the system was captive by the policing agency that was involved. This is going to change completely. And if indeed there's no changes to the legislation as we see it right now. At the end of it, the investigations will be external, the prosecutors will be external, and this new tribunal will be external as well, of all involvement with the actual affected police agency. This is a big, and I would say, go as far as to say, radical change in police accountability in this province.
Can I just pick up real quick on something too? We talk about investigation of complaints and then moving on to tribunal. But there was a critical part of the previous setup of the OAPRD, and that was third-party mediation. I spent a lot of time looking at that and researching it around the world, particularly in North America, and where there was an effective third-party mediation built in, staffed resource and built in to oversight bodies. You saw complaints go up, resolutions get to a higher level, and satisfaction of both the police officer and the aggrieved community member significantly increase.
Does this new law provide for that?
It does, and I'm hoping that there will be a greater level of investment and a greater level of focus on that aspect of it, equally to the investigation and potential prosecution of misconduct. But that shouldn't be lost. We shouldn't lose sight of that.
Sure. What kinds of transformations did you want to see in this act, and are they there?
Well, the accountability, one of the things that actually surprised me about this is we have a once-in-a-generation change or transformation in policing. And what struck me is how little public consultation there seemed to actually to be around this. And so I would have liked to have seen more Ontarians provided with the opportunity, and it was,
public hearings, that kind of thing?
There were some avenues provided, but like I think back to Police Week a couple of weeks ago, and I follow both the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services, who's overseen this bill, as well as relevant police associations online, on Twitter and the likes, and there was very little in the way of discussion about the fact that this review was ongoing during their tweets and their announcements over Police Week, which I was surprised about. I would have thought that if we're undergoing this great transformational review, that the public would have been given more opportunity to provide input. I think we need to recognize also that we have a model of policing now that's almost a couple of 100 years old. And so effectively what I think we've seen is the police tasked with more and more duties and take on more and more roles. And one of the things I think we could have seen, and we will see come out in the context of perhaps some privatization, is a parsing away of some of the functions that we have the police currently doing.
Such as?
Well, the biggest one being paid duty, construction sites, even sporting events and things like that. I think it's rather, and I'll use ridiculous to have a sworn police officer being paid overtime wages standing at a construction site when that role or
basically
that function,
glorified traffic cop,
precisely, could be filled by somebody else.
But that's a particularly controversial area of the changes to the Police Services Act, because the police associations are concerned they'll have less members if this goes into effect. And ironically, of course, the NDP is against it as well, because it would be taking people out of the public sector aspect of the workforce and potentially privatizing it. So it's a strangely polarizing issue.
Yeah, and I think there could be people working within policing agencies, perhaps, that are doing those functions, but they don't have to be sworn police officers. And so, there will be a determination of what the core policing function is, right? And I think that is great, but I think there are roles that could be filled by, as we call them now, civilian personnel that would still be working within the public sphere rather than for a private corporation.
And a lot
for example,
cheaper.
A lot cheaper that could fulfill those roles.
Oh, I'm in favor of it. I think when you look at the amount of money that municipally goes into policing, it's inevitable that we have to get hold of this budget. And as Peter would know better than I would, what is about 90% of the police budget is related to salaries and benefits?
We're between 87 and 93. Touched on private sector a couple of times. Regardless of the change in bill, public sector in general, policing, I would say even more specifically, needs to have more public-private partnerships. Regardless of how you see, whether it's lost jobs to the public sector or less membership dues coming into an association, or a chief who feels that he or she may lose control over their workforce. If you look at the element of cyber and all the crimes, if you look at the modernization, the need to leverage technology, if you look at the need for specialization around psychological services, health services, in designing and delivering these new community well-being plans, the police themselves aren't staffed for that level of expertise. So to be a modern police service, you have to have modern partnerships, some of which will include private sector partnerships. Some of it will include contracting and services that you don't have the HR resources or the capability to actually provide.
While you have the floor, you know that over many years, particularly in the capital city of this province, there have been very tense relations between officials with the police associations and the board. the Police Services Board. And, you know, my hunch is that's the same all over the province, but it's certainly been tricky here in Toronto. Is there anything in this new Safer Ontario Act that you think will ameliorate that situation?
You know, there's language in place in terms of, you know, the arbitration process of contracts that I think will create some opportunity for maybe the start of a different discussion. But of course, if parties don't come to the table to a degree with good faith to move through the usual sticking points, all the language in the Act isn't necessarily going to move things forward. I come back again to will and skill. I think, you know, the Act itself has to translate into action on behalf of the key stakeholders. Chiefs of police and their executive teams, boards and their executive committees, regional municipalities, the associations, the major stakeholders have to agree there is an opportunity, absolutely agree with Awkwasi. There's a once-in-a-generation opportunity with legislation as a foundation for us to think differently and act differently and deal with each other differently. If we fall back into the usual patterns, the Act itself is not going to be a silver bullet.
Do you want to follow on that?
I did, because policing, unfortunately, has been historically resistant to change. That's the nature of many large organizations and cultures. And so I don't think we should be held to the will of police associations not wanting necessarily to lose potential membership and revenue dues. And also, again, thinking about what exactly it is that they're doing. And so this transformation, especially with regards to the changing nature of our society and technological innovation, needs to be key in terms of considerations here.
Do you imagine, though, that once this law is proclaimed, and it does get phased in over the 5-year period of time that Ian suggested, that this will actually make a difference in the lives of individual Ontarians who have encounters with the police? Is that going to happen?
I think that, again, comes down, one, to implementation, and secondly, as Peter has said, to buy-in. So much about policing is perception, right? So we've talked about trust and confidence in the police and how people perceive the police. Well, a lot of that is how the police treat them and how the police behave. So if the different stakeholders at hand here, police boards, police services themselves, and the police association, act in a sense like they're creating some meaningful change, and I think that itself will create a perception amongst Ontarians that policing is changing, and that in itself will be positive.
I'll pick up on Awkwasi's points too. You know, the one thing that I get most excited about, quite frankly, in the Act are the community well-being plans. Again, you know, a plan could be something that just looks wonderful and sits on a desk and gathers dust. But, you know, what would mean a different thing for a rural Ontarian or a big city Ontarian if all of a sudden they saw published, here's how we're going to assess underlying social justice issues. Here's the data sources that we're going to have. By the way, you can comment on this. Here's the team that we've put together to work with the local police chief and the local board, and it involves health educators, health officials, educators who are known and respected within those communities. And they start to put together action plans that are developed in micro communities across the city or the township where they are, and they feel and see a different police response coordinated in a much more cohesive way. I think that will send a signal something has changed from a legislative standpoint. It's being felt. Again, execution of that, the true heart and purpose of what the deputy minister and his team put that together, that will, you know, we'll see if it actually comes true.
Yeah, I mean, I think the legislation, I mean, obviously there's always the personalities involved and what have you, but the legislation will facilitate more public confidence. On the SIU side, now there's going to be public reports of every time the SIU mandate is invoked. People are going to disagree with the results of the report, but at least they can see the reasoning process. Over on the public complaint side, and there will continue to be tension, may be a little strong, but there won't be a social consensus on a lot of the results that happen in any area of policing. But at least it will be independent. Right now, the general view is you can't win this battle. It's captive by the agencies, and therefore, every time they make a decision, which may be the right decision, that there ought not to be any discipline in these matters, the cynical public response is, well, of course that's going to be the answer. The OIPRD simply sends the investigations back to the affected police service. They're not interested in my public complaint, and even if there is a hearing, the fix is in because the chief has picked the prosecutor and the chief has picked the adjudicator. That's all going to go. That's all going to go. Now, it may be the stats at the end of the day don't change that much. There may be the same level of, say, findings that there has been misconduct. But I would like to think, because of the independence of it, and I'm hoping that transparency on the police complaint side as well, that there will be more of a buy-in, which will facilitate public confidence in policing.
Can I talk capital P politics with you for a second here?
Sure.
There is the possibility, I mean, I'm not making any predictions here, but there is the possibility that after June 7th, there may be a new government in the province of Ontario. These are all changes that are meant to be made to nonpartisan agencies, but these are changes that have been brought in by a Liberal government. What do you think about the possibility of these changes being overturned by a future Conservative or New Democratic Party government?
I think policing and justice themselves are inherently political. Both the NDP and PC have come out and said, like, Doug Ford is against, a number of the changes that have been brought about by the Liberals. So I think without a doubt, if there's a change in government, we will see some changes to these acts, to the Act, most definitely.
And do these agencies, which again are supposed to be removed from partisan politics, do they prepare themselves for a potential change in government in the way they do things, based on your experience?
I think whether you're private sector or public sector, you look at a change in municipal government, leadership, provincial and federal, and you anticipate what that might mean in terms of policy changes. More practically, probably looking in terms of what it might mean in material resource changes. So the Act itself, again, will and skill on behalf of the people that have to implement, but the willingness of whatever government's in place to fund it. There are significant funding requirements to allow, for instance, the OIPRD to get to a scale where they can do 100% of the investigation. That's one of the reasons why they had to send investigations back to police, because they didn't have the staff to do it. So, yeah, a new government comes in, they're still going to have to look at do their policy plans align with the legislation in existence, and does their funding formula match up with the investments they're going to have to make to bring this to life?
Okay. Again, in our remaining moments here, while you have the floor, I do want to ask you, as the former Deputy Chief of the Toronto Police Service, about the extraordinary events that took place Monday afternoon in the capital city, and in particular, the way that the police officer in question handled the whole thing. What did you think?
I mean, I'll say very quickly on behalf of this panel, Steve, if you don't mind. I mean, obviously our hearts go out to those who were victimized directly and indirectly, and I would suggest there's tens of thousands indirectly. I'll speak to the police officer's actions, and I was a voyeur like all of us. I have never seen, from a voyeur standpoint, that level of skill and capability, common sense and empathy and bravery in my time viewing police videos, never mind here in the city of Toronto. I still don't know the officer's name. I hope to find that out.
Joe Warmington from The Sun says his name is Ken Lamb.
If that's his name, Ken, congratulations to you, not just for your work in that particular crisis, but on behalf of policing right around the world. I've been to mass casualty scenes. Danzig shooting was the one and the Eaton Center shooting, both from 2012. But in terms of scale of total casualties and total fatalities, and we still don't know what that end state is, this has been one of, if not the most significant violent acts within Toronto's history. I think at all levels, police response, ambulance, coordinated through firefighters, coordinated through our hospitals, volunteers, and just average, good, decent Torontonians and Canadians, and visitors to the city, no doubt, because of where it took place. As good a job in as tragic a circumstance as we can imagine. But we saw the worst of humankind, the best of what this city and this country has to offer, and a pristine example of modern, progressive policing.
How is it that that officer saw clearly what he thought was a man draw a gun on him, and would have been well within his rights to fire his weapon in self-defense and end this thing that way? What do you think was going through his head, whereby he came to a very different risk assessment and decided, I think I can take this guy down without firing my revolver?
As a brief reminder, because sometimes these stats get lost in the human tragedies that come from these encounters, 97%, 98% of police encounters with people with mental health issues, and for sure that was a factor in this case, get resolved without any application of use of force. That was an example of that 97 to 98% outcome. This was on top of one of the most horrendous incidents that any police officer has ever faced in the city. So, is it training? Huge overhaul of training that we've seen in the last decade, but particularly since the Sammy Yatim shooting. And I'm sure there is some impact that triggered into that officer's...
Just remind everybody, Sammy Yatim was the mentally ill man on the streetcar. Who was fatally taken out by a police officer.
And the results of many of the recommendations from the Akabuchi report, I think, are probably showing themselves in the actions of that officer. But I think it would be a disservice to that officer and this police service and policing in this country to say that it was only training that allowed him to reach that level of professionalism. There is something innate in that human being, that individual who put on that uniform, to go out on that day. Something in that person allowed himself to get to that level. That was tremendous.
It was. Peter, thank you for that. Can I thank all of our guests for appearing on this program tonight? Peter Sloly with Deloitte. The former Deputy Chief of the Toronto Police Service, Awkwasi Owusu-Bempah from UTM, Ian Scott, visiting professor from Western University, formerly the head of the SIU in Ontario. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.